Hello and welcome to today's session, Ukrainecast Meet the Team, brought to you by the Radio Academy. Now, we're really excited to have our guests here, but quickly before we speak to them, I just wanted to mention the arias because the nominations are now out, which is very exciting, and you can buy your tickets now on the Radio Academy website. Now, I'm Roisin Hastie, I'm your host today. I host the weekly Radio Academy podcast, and I've also been covering the war in Ukraine every morning on the Radio 1 Breakfast Show, which I do the news for. So I'm an avid Ukrainecast listener as well, guys. So I'm very excited to pick your brains in just a bit. Now, you've been going since the war started, and we're just going to have a listen back to some of the highlights from the pod over the last 6 weeks.
How did you feel when you heard the news when you woke up this morning?
To be honest, Vic, I was really shocked. I'm shocked, and to be honest, I'm quite emotional about it.
And how it feels is like terrifying.
What we worry about is that we are losing our people and we are losing our country.
We managed to survive. I do not know how. My wife and my son are taken care of, being taken care of by doctors in the hospitals.
Whatever happens in this war, things will never go back to quote-unquote normal.
We're so happy to hear that you're okay and that you're safe. Hello, Mark.
Let me put the headphone into his ear. Hi.
Hi, Mark. I'm Victoria. I'm so happy to see you and to talk to you. How are you?
A bit well, yeah. Preparing for the surgery tomorrow.
Sirens went off. I was on the phone to her. She was really nervous, really tense.
Of course.
You know, the sounds of sirens. And also there's this feeling that this is our family home. I grew up there, and she may never see it again.
When I went out from the city, they saw that that my car is full of people, and if I opened the door, people just fell down. So they just look at me, check my passport, and I pass.
So as you can hear there, Ukrainecast is covering the war day-to-day, daily coverage as it's happening in real time. Now, we're joined by the host of the podcast, Victoria Derbyshire, and the BBC podcast senior editor, Jonathan Aspinwall. How did you get it off the ground so quickly? You know, as this conflict started, the podcast was born.
We were obviously hearing the reports about how British and American intelligence was saying that an invasion could be imminent. So we were really mindful of that, and we started those conversations really early on. The first key task that we faced was to work out the format, the tone, the presentation, and we were really thinking about those kind of trusted friends, those presenters who could bring their own experiences to the pod. And so that was really key with Gabriel Gatehouse and Victoria. Victoria would draw upon her broadcasting earlier in the day, and Gabriel would draw upon his vast amount of experience in the region. He has many, many contacts both in Russia and in Ukraine, has lived there. And we, both of them also have a strong reputation in the podcast and the audio world.
And how did you feel, Vic, being approached to present something like this?
Well, Jonathan rang me 2 days before the actual war began and said, would you want to do this? I said, yes, absolutely. Because it's about people, and I care about people, and I love talking to people. You know, these circumstances are horrific, but you want to hear from Ukrainians who are going through this.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some of the challenges that you face in just even getting guests on and wading through the disinformation that's out there. What have been some of the challenges that you've come across along the way?
In terms of finding guests, it is a challenge sometimes, particularly in areas where communications have gone down. So we've been very focused on Mariupol, which is a city where horrendous things are happening, and we are trying to document. We're trying to get testimony from that city, and it's hard. It's very difficult. You heard in the audio at the start of this episode, you heard Roman, who was a Ukrainian, and it makes me quite emotional actually to talk about it. A Ukrainian who went into Mariupol to save his family, and has now travelled in and out of Mariupol to rescue people. And it's extraordinary testimony when he came onto the pod. Very, very emotional, and it's heartbreaking what he's seen and what he's witnessed, and we have documented that. But it is difficult to find people from that city because it's an ongoing situation and it's a challenge.
But when we do, and it's either by, via social media or by getting numbers from other people, when we do, people want to talk because they want the world to know what they are experiencing, what they are witnessing, what they are living through.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there is a willingness of people. It's just whether we can get hold of them because of the lack of signal, the lack of, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big responsibility, isn't it, as journalists to be telling these people's stories and getting the truth out there and making sure that what is reported is the truth, isn't it?
I think that's why this is, in many ways, a uniquely BBC podcast. So not only are we drawing upon the testimony of people like Jeremy Bowen on the ground, the audio from Jeremy Bowen, which has been incredibly powerful, and he uses his words so carefully. I mean, his reporting is just been extraordinary. Not only are we drawing upon that, but then also you suddenly begin to realise what goes on in this building. So we have BBC Monitoring, which Vitaly works for. He's a Russian editor of BBC Monitoring, who we'll hear from later. And all of the painstaking work that they've been doing to find out what's the truth and what's valid information, what's right. So there's that challenge. And then there's also the BBC Language Services as well. So they're a huge resource, and they've been absolutely invaluable for this podcast. And we wanted to tap into those, in particular, those two sources to ensure that we got these unique insights of what is actually happening on the ground.
I mean, this is a story that is happening day to day, minute by minute. Things are changing. Every morning, do you get in? Do you have a meeting? Do you decide, OK, today this feels like the biggest thing happening in Ukraine or the most important thing? And you go from there?
We kind of, it's not a meeting in the old sense of the word. We're on WhatsApp, all of us, and we're all suggesting things or suggesting ideas or people we might want to speak to or what the focus might be for that day. And also we're guided by our listeners. We've got listeners right around the world. We absolutely love receiving emails, voice notes, WhatsApps from them. And sometimes it might be the focus from them because they want to know more about a particular area. And often we will be able to find an expert in that area, either within this building or outside. And so we'll bring them on and say, look, this listener in Sydney or Auckland or Toronto or California or the UK, we'd really like to know more about this. What's your take on this?
And I guess that's what sets this podcast apart from the other coverage going on across the BBC, because you don't have to necessarily follow the headlines. You can pick up on something that might be that you, as you say, your listeners like, we're not really sure what this means. And you can go, OK, well, today's episode, we're focusing on that then.
Yeah.
I mean, I am in awe of the level of response from the listeners, actually, and the engagement and the intelligence of the communication, actually. Our inbox, we always find valid questions. We always find fresh insights, sometimes things that we'd not actually considered. And they have been an absolutely invaluable resource right around the world. I mean, from Canada, from America, Australia, from Baltic states, all over the world, we're getting this input from the listeners, and it has become a crucial point, a crucial part of the actual podcast. And I've worked at Breakfast Telly, I've worked at 5 Live, worked at Radio 4. If I'm honest, I have never seen emails like these emails. The level of detail, their emotional response, the level of understanding, it's really special.
Yeah, it really is. And I think they are super, super curious. They want to know the kind of motivations, the background, the context, the historical context. And not only that, they are invested in the people, in the normal people that we speak to from Ukraine and Russia, actually, who have been on the podcast, who we keep going back to because we know not only do we want to find out what's happening and where they are on this journey of escape, but also the listeners absolutely want to know as well.
Yeah, and someone that you've had regularly on the podcast is Vitaly Shevchenko. And Vitaly, not only are you a BBC journalist, but you also have family in Ukraine. So that's been a really key narrative to the Ukrainecast podcast, is just even hearing from you how you're juggling your day job as a journalist with your personal family issues.
It is a strange situation, finding yourself and your family part of the story, but it's also a unique situation because that gives me a certain insight in how things are in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine particularly, where I'm from, and gives us a historical insight into the motives of what's been happening there. And working with Ukrainecast, in a way, it makes it easier to deal with this whole situation, because when you're facing this unbelievable injustice, horrendous cruelty, you can't watch it without wanting to do something about it. So working with Ukrainecast is me doing something about it, telling the world what I know about Russia and Ukraine and how things are there. So I would say without Ukrainecast, it would be much more difficult for me personally to cope with what's going on.
Wow, sorry, I didn't know that, Vitaly. I did not know that.
Well, yeah, Saturdays and Sundays are the most difficult days because you have to switch off. You have to stop following the news. Mm-hmm. And when you're not, you can't help thinking that, look, people are getting killed in your country. And here's you trying to watch a film or listen to some music or do some cycling. So Monday to Friday is what comes naturally, doing a lot of work and telling the world about what I see as the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, do you guys share that sentiment as well? Does it feel, we are so helpless with what is going on in Ukraine, but by doing our jobs as journalists, we are helping in some way?
I mean, going from the response of listeners, I would say, yes, we are learning. I am learning and helping, hopefully, others understand what is going on and the apparent motivations behind it from Russia's point of view. That's all we can do. It is our job to report what we see, to report what we hear, to provide a safe space for people in Ukraine to say, look, this is happening to me, and then to publish it and to let people around the world make up their own mind.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan?
Yeah, and it's difficult at times for we're aware that we are hearing very harrowing accounts, testimony which has just shocked us to the core, and a huge amount of respect to Vitaly from all of us on the team. He has been a crucial, an absolutely key figure on this podcast, and we couldn't have done it without Vitaly. And sometimes I don't know how he has done it, to be quite frank. So the whole team have a huge amount of gratitude and respect, and not only for the testimony of the way he's talked about his parents and what's happened to his parents, and perhaps Vic can talk about that as well. But I also feel his skill set in terms of his experience over the years, working for BBC Monitoring, his awareness of disinformation, his awareness of the media, both in Russia and in Ukraine. It has been absolutely crucial in the podcast. And one final thing to say about that actually is sometimes we also have eyewitnesses who don't speak English on the pod, and he translates on the pod. You would have heard it.
It's amazing.
It is extraordinary. It is, and it has provided some of the most powerful moments on the podcast. And I can't imagine what it must be like doing that translation, hearing these accounts of horrific actions, and he's kept his professionalism throughout the podcast. So we are hugely grateful for that.
Mm-hmm. And how do you balance and manage the content of this podcast? Because it's so harrowing what is happening in Ukraine. Do you have conversations where you think we absolutely need to go into this level of awful detail about what's happening, or is there like any sheltering at all?
This is a grown-up podcast, so we're really aware of that. I've got 2 kids who are 10 and 12, and I know I've been complying, which means I'm listening to the podcast at the end of the day, checking that everything's okay with it, and the children will be in the room, and I'm really aware of that. And sometimes I'll put my headphones on as opposed to putting it on loudspeakers, because this is an adult podcast, and we are aware that we don't want to sanitize things. We are aware that we put warnings on the podcast, obviously, as all podcasts can, and we guide the listeners through this. So Victoria or Gabriel's now on paternity leave, but when Gabriel was on the podcast, they will alert listeners to the fact we're going to hear some harrowing testimony. We're also aware in the editorial mix that we sometimes have to vary the tone, we have to vary the interviews. We may pull back and do something more analytical at certain points, because these are hard stories to hear, they're hard testimony to hear, and we find it hard, and we're aware the listeners find it hard as well. So we are constantly analysing how we structure this podcast to ensure that that listeners are able to learn insights and also hear the testimony as well.
And I guess, people are listening to this because they want to know what's going on in Ukraine. So they also have to brace themselves that there's going to be things that they're not going to enjoy listening to. This isn't something you listen to because you're enjoying the content. You listen because you're informing yourself. And I guess it demonstrates how people's listening habits have changed. This is a news podcast, but it's for people to listen to when they want to, because they want to be across this massive, massive news story.
Yeah, definitely. But also the way it unfolded over the weeks, despite the trauma and the horrors of what we have heard about in Ukraine, there are moments of joy. As difficult as it is, Vitaly managed to get his dad out of Ukraine, and earlier this week, Vitaly's dad walks into this studio in New Broadcasting House in London with his son, Vitaly, who'd got him out of that country. And he was here on the podcast. And Amazing. It was really special, Vitaly, I have to say. It was a moment of joy. And we heard Max in the audio that we played at the beginning. On the second day of the war, his apartment was hit by a Russian missile. He and his wife and his 2 sons, a 19-year-old and 11-year-old, were in that apartment. God knows how they survived. His wife and 19-year-old were injured. We have followed that family as they escaped from Ukraine. They went to Moldova. They are now in Israel. We spoke to his son, Mark. You heard his son, Mark, talking to us from the hospital bed. He's alive. He's being treated. There are glimmers of hope in amongst the kind of death and devastation.
Yeah, and
for me, if I can jump in,
to
me, this is of course a very dark time, but also it's a time of unbelievable human kindness. Time and again, we hear stories of complete strangers helping other people, offering them shelter, transport, food, and that applies to my parents as well. And my father would not be here had it not been for numerous strangers who had helped him along the way. And it's very humbling. And at the same time, it inspires faith in human nature. It's times of war is when human nature comes out, the worst of it and the best of it. And this is what gives us hope, really.
Yeah. Absolutely. And actually, your dad, Vitaly, Vitaly's dad is called Alexander, used this phrase, empathy is in the air. And it really is. There are so many people, Vitaly is absolutely right, so many people right across the world who've done something to try and help, even if it's just a small thing. And, I think Jeremy Bowen has said it on the podcast, Fergal Keane has said it on the podcast. In these times, you see the worst and you see the best of humanity, as Vitaly said.
Which you guys are dealing with on a daily basis. And I was listening to the podcast this week, and there was a woman on who you were speaking to, and she'd been in the car with her husband and I think it was like her son's mother in the back, and her husband was killed in that car journey, and she talked about her neighbours being in the front and their children being killed, and she got very emotional recounting this. It's so raw, and day to day, that's what you're dealing with, and then you go home, Victoria and Jonathan, and you go back to your own families. Is it something you leave at the door, or do you have to talk about it when you're home?
I mean, I talk about it. I'm a talker. That is my therapy, talking to my husband, or I've got teenage sons, they're 18 and 15, they know exactly what's going on in Ukraine. I don't leave it at the door. I just don't. I can't. I don't want to,
I do think that the BBC is... we have many conversations about how we can decompress, and obviously there'll be huge conversations going on in Ukraine for the teams who are out in Ukraine, and they will have witnessed horrific things, and there is an awful lot of support for those people in the field. Back here in the UK, as a team, as a senior news editor, we do talk about things a lot. We encourage our teams to talk about it. There are lots of services that the BBC provide as well. And I think that's important. And there are lots of boundaries that we place as well. So WhatsApp has been a huge aspect of our day-to-day working lives. But also, it can be a difficult challenge, I think, for teams. And you'll know this in your day-to-day job, that sometimes when you're working and you're bombarded with WhatsApp messages when you're off shift. So actually, we have introduced a lot of rules around WhatsApp. And if it's really important, if something's really important that we need to communicate to our teams, we do it via email. And we don't expect teams, when they're off duty, to be looking at their WhatsApp messages. There is no expectation of that, because people do need to switch off. These are heavy, heavy stories, and people need to be able to decompress.
And it's hard when your job is news, because the news doesn't stop, does it? And you feel like, you always could be more across something, and you've got to follow every single update. But I guess that's what the team is for when you do get together and you do plan what's going into each episode. Is there like a formula for a Ukrainecast episode, or is every day just completely blank slate?
There is a rough formula, and it's rough because we want to be dynamic. We want to shape it around the strongest content. We know that the first 15 minutes of the pod is really, really crucial. Obviously, people are leaning into podcasts. It's a much more... obviously, this audience will understand this, but it's a much more assertive situation, much less passive than sometimes radio. That's my perception of it.
Because you choose to download something.
Because you choose to download it, yeah. You don't just have it on in the background. You are listening in, you're leaning in, is the phraseology we often use. So I think, what was the question? Sorry.
It was do you have a formula, or is there a website?
Yeah, so we are always aware that we would like a very strong case study. We want that in motion. We want to understand what's happening on the ground. Then we have a family of experts, and we're really aware of the gender balance of those experts. There are a lot of men in this field, in conflict studies and in war studies. So we're always searching out for female contributors. And then the team itself, we have to. Sometimes it's easy to squeeze out the expertise we actually have in the studio. So Vitaly, Victoria, who will have been broadcasting on the news at 1, who would have been on the news channel, who almost is doing an on-air research program in the morning. And then Gabriel has a huge amount of experience. He has been based in Ukraine, based in Russia. He has many contacts in the area. He's constantly on WhatsApp, talking to people in Russia and Ukraine, his friends. He's got very, very powerful stories about what's happened to his friends.
And he's covered many wars.
Yeah.
So he really, he knows about the propaganda side of things, the disinformation side of things. And, he's taught all of us, I think, and people listening to Ukrainecast, we question everything. Doesn't matter who it comes from. We question it.
Yeah, and there's so many crucial elements to the team as well, because you've mentioned there's a team of correspondents on the ground in Ukraine. I guess they're the ones who can go out and find you case studies from the area to maybe speak to, or you're using social media to find those people as well.
I think just using their scripts, if I'm honest as well. They're testimony. their words. You know, I said earlier about how they agonize, I'm sure, and out in the field, they agonize over the words that they're using, because there's so much weight at this time given to a BBC editor who is in the field. Their reports matter so much. So we draw upon that really, really carefully. And we use their audio. I mean, this is the strength of this podcast, is the importance of on the ground audio, weaving that audio in a way in which we really analyze and how we're going to bring the audio in, how long will the audio last, and you're able to do that in a podcast in a very, very skillful way. We're very fortunate to have a very strong studio editor who is very skilled at bringing the audio in at the right moment.
She's called Emma Crow.
Yes, Emma Crow.
Nice to give her a shout out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you've mentioned several times the response from the audience to this podcast, and as a brand, Ukrainecast is something that a lot of BBC Sounds, BBC audiences will be familiar with as, you know, Brexitcast, Newscast. Is that helpful in terms of like signposting it on the app even?
Yeah, I mean, we know that launching a podcast is really challenging. It's a very, very competitive market. It's very difficult to launch a podcast from scratch. And we're fortunate. We had the weight of the BBC News machine behind us. So we've got various levers that we pulled to try and get word out about the podcast. So the website, the social media channels, they've all been absolutely crucial in getting promotion and getting the impact. So yeah, it's been.
So BBC doesn't always collaborate in the way it should, but in this example, is that fair? You're raising your eyebrows at me. Jonathan knows exactly what I mean. You probably do as well, Roisin, and you, Vitaly. But this is an example of where everybody pulled together.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And actually, I think the montage that we'll have seen at the beginning of this chat, I think that is also a social video, because it's so important now, isn't it, that we need to be everywhere. You know, people need to come across
Every
it on their
platform
feeds and things.
Yeah, we do. But a newscast and our skills are using what we've learned from Newscast was absolutely crucial. It was the nimbleness, if that's a word, nimbleness of the operation. Yeah, the speed at which we set this all up, and that was partly based because we had the expertise in this BBC News podcast team. There's some brilliant producers here.
I mean, they really are.
They really are. Yeah.
Ambitious and creative and focused and clever and kind.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you need. I can see from both of you, I mean, all three of you, that this is something you're so passionate about as a service that you're delivering, and you've all got so much experience in the BBC, outside the BBC, as journalists, as broadcasters. Is there anything that you've learned from doing Ukrainecast that you didn't think that you didn't know before?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, Gabriel is an example when it comes to questioning absolutely everything. You know, sometimes your heart really wants something to be true, and Gabriel is saying we need to just question this as much as we would the other side. For example, I mean, I don't think I've learnt about the resilience of people. I think it's confirmed in me that people in the worst times can find a strength, a resilience that perhaps they didn't know they had. Vitaly, would that be fair when we're talking? I mean, we can't generalise about the Ukrainian population, but that is the feeling that I have so strongly about Ukrainian people.
Absolutely. What I've learned is how strong and determined people are, not just Ukrainians, but anyone who is involved in the conflict, in the war, who's following it. And one thing that stands out for me is how strong are some of our contributors talking about horrific things that have happened to them, to their nearest and dearest, that woman who lost her husband and neighbours. And yet they are prepared to talk to us about it in a very unemotional, I would say an emotional way, as if relating something that's not happened to them, as if telling us that this is something that isn't about me, but it's about human nature, and this is what the world should know. And it's as if they are doing the world a service, if you like. And frankly, I had not expected that. I had not expected people to be so strong in relating unspeakable things on a podcast.
I think your point about generalizations is interesting as well, Vic, because Gabriel has taught us the importance of not making generalizations about Russians, about the Russian people, making that distinction between the Kremlin and Russian people. And that's been an important lesson and an important reminder for me. And then the second thing, the thing I've learned from Vic, which I worked with Vic almost 20 years ago, and it was exactly the same then, it's the ability to ask a super direct question. And sometimes it's only 4 words long, but we get in a kind of presenters get in sometimes in a trap of asking very lengthy questions, sometimes because they're trying to demonstrate their knowledge, when actually a super direct, very short question can be incredibly powerful. And I think that's what Vic has certainly brought to the table on numerous occasions in this pod, and it's created some very powerful moments.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to turn the tables now because I'm going to ask you some questions from the audience, Vic.
Okay.
So, well, all of you, but we'll start with you, Victoria. So we've had a question from someone who says to you, what's it like hosting this podcast rather than hosting a radio show or a TV show that you've done before?
So this is most like when I worked on 5 Live, where I felt there's authority and there's gravitas, and if you add up Vitaly's experience and Gabriel's and mine, it's many decades, but there's still that warmth and informality, which I think is a kind of characteristic of 5 Live. It feels quite different to the TV news, which is a bit more formal, although I still try and get informality in that. It feels a bit like our old TV programme, in that I feel like this is meaningful work. This is, talking to people who are going through this, and we're giving them the space to tell their truth in that phrase, to get it out there. That feels like something the BBC should absolutely be doing.
Your relationship with the audience.
Yeah.
I mean, that's absolutely key, isn't it? Yeah. And you can see their response to Vic and Gabriel, that they are directly contacting both of them with points, with questions.
I mean, I get so many DMs on Instagram and Twitter from people who are listening. And also I've met Vitaly, who I have never met before. And, we now chat ourselves on WhatsApp separately. Those kind of friendships are new and special, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great industry to work in terms of just the people that you get to work with. And, everyone in this room pulls, more than their weight to make this happen. That's so clear. Maybe this is one for all of you to chip in on, but how do you make a complicated story like Ukraine easier to understand?
You see, I would argue, actually, it's not as complicated as it might seem. Vitaly, what would you say?
I was going to say, it sounds like a pretty straightforward story, at least easier to understand than some of the other conflicts where tensions had been bubbling under the surface for years, and then suddenly it all erupts. What we're dealing with is, when it boils down to the fact that it's one country attacking another, it's pretty simple. And what I think my job on the podcast is go beyond that and explain why this is happening, what caused it, what are the historical reasons for it, what are the motives by driving politicians involved in the war. And that, I think, is not as difficult to comprehend as some of the other conflicts that I've been following. Those sound incredibly complicated to me, but this one, well, it's Russia attacking Ukraine.
Also, being honest about what you don't know. I think that's really important. Being upfront and honest. I think sometimes, because there is a danger that you only deal with certainties. Sometimes it's about being clear about the uncertainties, and we are really clear about that.
Yeah, and maybe it's because it is a podcast format, because I think one of the first times that I properly heard correspondents or journalists in a news setting say, we just don't know, was when they were talking about Brexit, because there were so many uncertainties, and that was on the Brexitcast podcast. And maybe that's, this format does help with that a little bit as well.
Well, also, presenters have to have the confidence to say that. They have to have the security in their own kind of sometimes lack of knowledge, and that's okay. These people are usually respected. They come armed with so much experience. It's okay to say, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Also, someone's asked, what have been your standout moments from the podcast? Is there anything that's just really stuck with you?
Yeah. I mean, so much. What would you say, Vitaly?
For me, two recent interviews, a refugee from Bucha who lost her husband and was wounded trying to leave that town, and the interview we had yesterday with a refugee from Mariupol who described her harrowing route out of Mariupol and how her mother was made to strip in front of Russian soldiers who made jokes about her. That's something that's going to stay with me for the rest of my life.
I would say the story of Max and his family, who I mentioned earlier, who, as he put it, it's 1 billion to 1 chance that they survived when that Russian missile hit their apartment block. And I would say the listeners. The feedback from the listeners, the contact with the listeners, the relationship we have with our listeners.
I share what both Vitaly and Victoria said. I'd also, for me, we spoke to a lady called Anna, and we followed her story. And the interesting thing about Anna was you could feel that there was absolute disbelief that this was happening. And she had faced a dilemma of whether to stay in her home or to leave Ukraine. And I can't imagine what that dilemma must be like. Should I stay or should I go? And you could feel her uncertainty. You could feel the weight of that decision. What's the right thing to do? What's the right thing to do for my family? And she talked about having a panic attack in her bathroom, in her bath. We followed her story. She is now, at the moment, she is safe. And we were hugely relieved at that. But her story will stay with me for a long time, because you could just hear her shock that this was panning out in the way it's panning out.
This question feels like a good one to finish on, and perhaps one for you to answer, Jonathan. What's the future of Ukrainecast? Obviously, we don't know when this war will end. How do you make sure the audience keeps wanting to hear about this? Is it open-ended? Are you ever going to go to Ukraine to host the podcast there? Anything in the pipeline?
We would like to go to Ukraine. We'd like Victoria to go to Ukraine. I think that would be. I think that's important. I think that's important for the pod. And obviously these decisions are complex and they're difficult and they have to be safe decisions. And Victoria has been on a hostile environment course very recently, last week. It was last week. So that's absolutely something that we would like to see, the Ukrainecast team would like to see. I think to be honest, we're taking it at the moment almost week by week. And we are committed to this story, so we're not going to pull away from this story. It would be wrong for us to pull away from this story. And we have such an extraordinary community of listeners that we feel it's a very important public service that we want to continue doing.
Absolutely. That's interesting as well that you've done the hostile environment training, because I think people listening to the BBC's output might not understand that journalists do that kind of training. That in order to go to a war zone, you need to be fully prepared for that. What kind of things did you learn?
Lots of first aid, really, really useful. How to, the kind of things you need to look out for when you might be in a crowd of people. What's your exit strategy? How does all the team feel? If anybody says, look, I don't feel comfortable, then you all go, that kind of thing. And just sort of general awareness, general vigilance, social media, and how to put body armour on.
And going to Ukraine would be obviously amazing for the podcast, and personally, that's something you'd want to do as well.
I you know, like any journalist, you know, you want to go to where a story is, to talk to people, to see it for yourself, to hear for yourself, to look people in the eye, because that is the best way of reporting anything.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your insight on Ukrainecast, because I'm sure anyone watching this has an interest in the podcast, and it's great to hear what goes on behind the scenes. So big thank you to Vitaly, Victoria, Jonathan, the whole Ukrainecast team.
Definitely the whole team,
yeah.
Sam, Estelle,
team
Danny,
effort.
the whole lot. Everyone been brilliant.
Yeah, and a big thank you to the Radio Academy events team as well for putting this on. Thank you so much for listening.